America, the land of the free, home of the brave, and increasingly a place where you might want to watch what you say. I know, that sounds dramatic, but lately there's been this vibe, like a weird tension in the air, and it all circles back to a pretty fundamental question. Are we, as a nation, edging towards authoritarianism? Now, I'm not saying we're suddenly living in some dystopian nightmare, but there are some concerning signs, some trends that, well, they're just not sitting right. So tonight, let's unpack some of these unsettling developments and ask ourselves, is the US government taking a page from the authoritarian playbook? Okay, so let's talk about this whole domestic terrorism thing. Now, I understand property damage, violence, those are serious issues. But lately, it feels like the government's throwing that label around like confetti at a gender reveal party. Gone wrong. We're seeing people who vandalize pipelines or even just protest too loudly being branded as domestic terrorists. And you know, that's not just semantics. Because when you slap that label on someone, it carries a whole lot of baggage. It's designed to shut down debate, to make people think twice about speaking out. It's about fear, not justice. And that, my friends, is straight out of the authoritarian playbook. Let's be clear, words matter, especially when they come from people in positions of power. And lately, the rhetoric coming from some pretty high places has been, shall we say, a little spicy. We're talking about phrases like the days of committing crimes without consequence are ended. Now, on the surface, that might sound reasonable enough. Who likes crime, right? But when you dig a little deeper, it starts to feel a bit more ominous. Because what exactly does that mean? What about due process? What about the right to a fair trial? These statements, they're not just off-the-cuff remarks. They're deliberate, they're calculated, and they send a very clear message: step out of line, and there will be consequences. Now let's talk about everyone's favorite topic, corporations. Specifically, the increasingly cozy relationship between big business and the government. Now, I'm not saying that all corporations are evil empires, but when you see the Department of Justice prioritizing the protection of a private company like, say, Tesla over the civil liberties of protesters, it does make you wonder who's really calling the shots. Because that, my friends, is not a democracy. That's what we call corporate authoritarianism, where the government essentially acts as a shield for corporate interests, even if it means trampling on the rights of ordinary citizens. Look, I know what you're thinking. Donald, you're saying you're being a bit dramatic, aren't you? This is America. We don't do authoritarianism. And you're right, historically speaking, we haven't been great at it, but that doesn't mean we're immune. Because guess what? This whole labeling your opponents as terrorists thing, it's not exactly a new trick. In fact, it's a tried and true tactic used by authoritarian regimes throughout history. We're talking fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, Putin's Russia, China under Xi Jinping. The list goes on, and the playbook is always the same: silence dissent, consolidate power, and rule through fear. So, we've got the government increasingly using the terrorist label to silence dissent. We've got powerful people using language that sends a chilling message about consequences for those who step out of line. And we've got corporations getting cozy with the government in a way that makes you wonder who's really in charge. Now, you might be thinking, Donald, this all sounds very abstract. What does it actually look like in practice? Well, let me tell you a little story about some protesters and a certain electric car company. You see, when you start threatening people with terrorism charges for protesting a company like Tesla, you're sending a very clear message. Corporate interests are now national security interests. And anyone who threatens those interests, well, let's just say they're not going to have a good time. So, is the US government turning authoritarian? That's a question for the ages, isn't it? But I'll say this. When you see the government increasingly labeling dissent as terrorism, when you hear powerful figures using language that chills free speech, when you witness the blurring of lines between corporate and state power, well, it's certainly not something to ignore. Because here's the thing about authoritarianism. It doesn't happen overnight. It creeps in slowly, subtly, often disguised as something else entirely. It starts with a crackdown here, a new law there, a chilling statement from someone in power, and before you know it, the very foundations of democracy have been eroded. So stay vigilant, my friends. The future of our democracy might just depend on it.